It was a crisp morning, the kind where the golden sunlight filters through the trees, casting long shadows on neatly trimmed lawns. Chief James Mitchell, a dedicated law enforcement officer, stepped outside, steaming coffee in hand, ready to begin another day at the precinct. The neighborhood was still, save for the soft chirping of birds and the distant hum of morning traffic. Everything seemed as it always had, calm, orderly, predictable. But then something caught his eye. A bright green slip of paper flapped under his windshield wiper, fluttering in the morning breeze like a warning flag. His heart sank. A fine. James frowned, setting his coffee on the hood of his car as he carefully peeled the notice from his windshield. $79 violation. Improper lawn maintenance. He let out a slow, measured breath, glancing at his front yard. The grass was green, lush, and recently mowed. It wasn't a manicured golf course, but it was far from unkempt. He had lived in this neighborhood for 15 years, and not once had his lawn been an issue. Then he saw her, a figure in a sharply tailored suit, blonde bob bouncing, as she strutted down the sidewalk, tablet in hand. Karen Mitchell, the newest and most zealous member of the Homeowners Association, was on her morning inspection walk. "Good morning, Mr. Mitchell," she called out with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. James held up the violation notice. "Mind explaining this?" Karen barely glanced at it before tapping away at her tablet. Section 7, Paragraph 3 of the HOA guidelines clearly states that grass height must not exceed 3 inches. Yours is approximately 3.5. James narrowed his eyes. "You're serious?" Karen gave a saccharine smile. "Rules are rules, Mr. Mitchell. If the fine isn't paid within 72 hours, it doubles." She took a step closer, eyes scanning his property with the scrutiny of a tax auditor. "Oh! And you might want to do something about those garden gnomes. They're not on the approved decoration list." James clenched his jaw. Those gnomes had been there for over a decade, placed lovingly by his late wife. Karen didn't care. She tapped her screen and walked off, her heels clicking like a metronome of impending tyranny. Something in James shifted. This wasn't just about his lawn. This was about power. And he wasn't going to back down. Karen Mitchell had lived in the neighborhood for less than 6 months before clawing her way onto the HOA board. Unlike past board members, who upheld community standards with fairness and discretion, Karen had turned her new position into a personal crusade for modernization. Her mission? Absolute control. She changed rules overnight, finding people for mailbox colors, driveway cracks, and even holiday decorations that weren't removed promptly enough. Her justification? We must maintain the aesthetic integrity of the neighborhood. But James, as a seasoned lawman, knew the truth. Karen wasn't enforcing rules for the community's benefit. She was consolidating power, preying on those who couldn't fight back. The firefighter down the street had been fined for his kid's basketball hoop. An elderly widow received multiple citations for her flower garden. And just last week, Sarah, the ER nurse next door, had been written up for leaving her garbage bins out a few hours too long after pulling a double shift at the hospital. Karen wasn't maintaining order. She was terrorizing hardworking people. James started to dig deeper, talking to his neighbors, gathering complaints. Patterns emerged. This wasn't just random enforcement. She was targeting people who worked long hours, people who had less time to contest violations. He had spent 25 years upholding the law, fighting against injustice. And now, standing in his own front yard, staring at a ridiculous $79 fine, he realized something chilling. The real threat to his community wasn't some outside criminal element. It was Karen Mitchell. 2 days after receiving the violation, James returned home from a grueling double shift. A bank robbery had turned into an hours-long hostage situation, and all he wanted was to park his car, take a hot shower, and get some rest. But as he turned onto his street, his exhaustion turned to disbelief. 2 black SUVs emblazoned with HOA security were parked directly in his driveway. Karen stood on his lawn, taking pictures of his property, her tablet glowing ominously in the dimming evening light. She snapped photos of his mailbox, his garden hose, even his welcome mat. James took a deep breath, stepping out his car. "Excuse me," he said, voice calm but firm. "You're blocking my driveway. Karen turned, her expression smug. Mr. Mitchell, our neighborhood's most persistent rule breaker. She tapped her screen. Let's see. Unpaid fine for lawn violations, unapproved garden gnome placement, and she paused dramatically. Non-regulation mailbox color. James blinked. Non-regulation what? Karen smirked. Your mailbox is white. But according to our new guidelines, all mailboxes must be pristine pearl white from the Anderson Paint Company collection. Yours is clearly classic white, a completely different shade. James couldn't help it. He laughed. You think this is funny? Karen snapped. These security officers are here to enforce compliance. James glanced at the officers. Two burly men in ill-fitting uniforms leaned against the SUVs, watching the scene unfold with bored expressions. Their badges didn't look right. Too shiny, too generic. His instincts flared. Karen, he said carefully, the security company, who hired them? She folded her arms. The HOA did. We have full authority to enforce community standards. James pulled out his phone, pulling up the city's business license database. 3 taps later, he had his answer. There was no licensed security company by that name. These weren't real officers. James had dealt with plenty of shady private security firms in his career. Untrained, unregulated outfits that often operated just on the edge of the law. But this was something else. The security guards had badges that looked like cheap replicas, their uniforms mismatched, and most suspiciously of all, their company wasn't even registered. He took a step closer, lowering his voice. Karen, this security team is parked illegally. You're blocking access to my property. That's a violation of City Ordinance 20 to 345. For the first time, Karen's confidence wavered. I have full authority. No, James interrupted. You don't. He turned to the guards. Who's your supervisor? They exchanged a glance. Mr. Mitchell? Karen's brother. James clenched his jaw. It was all falling into place. That night, James dug deeper. He mapped out every violation issued since Karen took power. The pattern was undeniable. She was targeting emergency workers, people with unpredictable schedules who couldn't challenge her citations easily. Firefighters, nurses, teachers, people like him. And then his deputy sent him a text. Chief, you're not going to believe this. Remember that flooding issue last spring? Karen's brother got the contract for drainage repairs at 3 times the normal cost. James sat back, staring at the evidence piling up before him. This wasn't just HOA overreach. This was corruption. And Karen had no idea that the man she had been harassing wasn't just another homeowner. She had just picked a fight with the chief of police. And he was about to fight back. James Mitchell was a man of action. He had spent years solving crimes, piecing together scattered details to form the bigger picture. But this time, the crime wasn't a robbery or assault. It was something more insidious. It was about power, control, and corruption disguised as neighborhood improvement. That night, unable to shake the feeling that Karen's actions weren't just personal, he did what any good investigator would. He started looking for evidence. Sitting at his desk, he logged into the neighborhood's private Facebook group, a place where residents usually shared things like lost pet alerts or recommendations for local handymen. But lately, the tone had shifted. Post after post detailed absurd fines, aggressive security officers, and homeowners being written up for minor infractions. The sheer number of complaints was staggering. Got fined $100 because my trash bin was 6 inches from the curb instead of 12. Karen's security team knocked on my door at 10 p.m. demanding I move my parked car from my own driveway. I'm a single mom working 2 jobs, and I just got fined for my kids' chalk drawings on the sidewalk. They cited my elderly father for his rose bushes. He's had them for 30 years. How is this happening? A sinking feeling settled in James' gut. This wasn't just Karen being overly strict. This was targeted harassment. The complaints followed a pattern. Nurses, firefighters, teachers, elderly homeowners. People who either worked long hours or weren't physically able to challenge every citation. People who were less likely to fight back. Karen wasn't just enforcing HOA rules. She was weaponizing them. James leaned back in his chair, staring at his screen. Something still wasn't adding up. Karen had only been on the HOA board for a few months, yet she had implemented sweeping changes with almost no resistance. How had she gained so much control so quickly? Then, he remembered something. The so-called security company that had blocked his driveway earlier that day. Mitchell Security Solutions. His gut told him to dig deeper. Pulling up the county's business registry, he typed in the company's name. Within seconds, the results appeared. Date registered 3 months ago. Owner, Thomas Mitchell. James sat up straight. Karen's maiden name was Mitchell. Her brother owned the security company. A few more clicks, and things got even worse. The company had no physical office, just a P.O. box. No legitimate business license. No insurance. It wasn't just a shady operation. It was an illegal one. Karen had installed her own family's company as the HOA's enforcement arm, and she had never disclosed it. This was a blatant conflict of interest and possibly fraud. James exhaled, fingers drumming on the desk. Karen thought she was untouchable. She thought she could intimidate the entire neighborhood into silence. She was about to learn how wrong she was. The next morning, as James was heading out for work, his elderly neighbor, Mrs. Chun, hurried over, looking anxious. "Chief," she whispered, glancing over her shoulder as if someone might be watching. "I saw them installing cameras last night." James frowned. "Cameras?" She nodded. "On the streetlights. They didn't ask for approval. And they're not facing the roads, they're pointed at houses." A chill ran down James' spine. "Which houses?" he asked. Mrs. Chin hesitated before answering. "Yours, Sarah's, Mark's, all the people who have been complaining about Karen." James' blood ran cold. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was surveillance. He had spent his entire career dealing with criminals who thought they were above the law. Karen was no different. The difference? She had underestimated him. He thanked Mrs. Chun and immediately made some calls. If Karen had installed those cameras without city approval, it was a direct violation of privacy laws. And if she was collecting footage without permission, that was illegal surveillance. James had been playing defense long enough. It was time to go on the offensive. That afternoon, James made a trip to the county clerk's office. If Karen was willing to break one rule, chances were she was breaking others. He was right. Sifting through public records, he found something interesting. A business registration for Karen Mitchell. Type, home-based childcare services. Status, active. James almost laughed. Karen had been running a daycare center out of her home. The very same HOA rules she used to fine other homeowners for operating businesses from their houses explicitly prohibited home-based childcare. And she didn't have a state license either. James took out his phone and snapped a photo of the document. This was gold. Karen had spent months bullying people for minor infractions while breaking the very rules she claimed to uphold. At the next HOA meeting, she wouldn't just be answering for her security scam. She'd be answering for this too. That evening, James was on his way home when his phone buzzed. A message from Mark, the firefighter who lived down the street. "Chief, you need to see this." Attached were several photos of Karen's security vehicles blocking the fire lane. James clenched his jaw. Fire lanes weren't just suggestions. They were lifelines. Every second counted in an emergency. And if a fire truck couldn't get through because some fake security guard was parked in the way, lives could be lost. Mark's next message sent James over the edge. "We had a medical emergency in the neighborhood yesterday. Paramedics had to park down the block and wheel the stretcher past Karen's SUVs. If that patient had needed CPR, they might not have made it." James gripped the steering wheel, white-knuckled with fury. This wasn't about neighborhood rules anymore. This was about public safety. Karen had no idea what she had done. She had turned a petty power trip into a criminal offense. And James? He was going to make sure she paid for it. The turning point. James now had everything he needed. Evidence of Karen's targeted harassment. Proof that her security company was fraudulent. Confirmation that she was illegally surveilling homeowners. Documentation that she was violating HOA rules with her own business. Witness accounts that her security team was obstructing emergency services. Karen thought she was invincible. She thought no one would dare challenge her. But she had made one critical mistake. She had underestimated who she was up against. James wasn't just a frustrated homeowner. He was the chief of police. And justice was coming. James sat at his kitchen table, staring at a mountain of paperwork. Over the past few days, he had collected every fine issued under Karen's rule. The numbers were staggering. 47 fines in 3 months. 35 of them targeted first responders and essential workers. A total of $115,000 in penalties. Reading through the violations, James felt his anger rising. $200 for a garden gnome. $150 for a mailbox that was the wrong shade of white. $300 for excessive decorations because a widow left her Christmas lights up 2 days past Karen's deadline. One violation stood out. Sarah, the ER nurse. She had received a $500 fine because her garbage bin was left out for an extra day. Why? Because she had been working a double shift, saving lives. James clenched his fists. This wasn't just about money. This was abuse of power. And it was time for Karen to answer for it. The next evening, the community center was packed. It was the most crowded HOA meeting in neighborhood history. Karen stood at the front of the room, flipping through a stack of papers, preparing to push through her new security measures. She had no idea what was coming. James waited patiently, letting her ramble about community safety and protecting property values. But the moment she called for a vote, he stood up. Before we proceed, James said, his voice steady, I have some information to share with the board. Karen's smile faltered. Now's not the time for her. James walked to front of the room, badge in hand. For those who don't know me, I'm Chief James Mitchell, he announced, and I've been investigating some troubling activity within this HOA. A ripple of whispers spread through the room. Karen's face went pale. James pulled out his folder, flipping through documents as he spoke. First, let's talk about your security company. Mitchell Security Solutions is unlicensed. Your brother owns it, and you never disclosed that to the board. He held up business records. That's fraud. Karen stiffened. That's a baseless accusation. James ignored her, clicking the projector remote. The first image appeared on the screen. Karen's illegal home daycare. Gasps filled the room. You've been citing homeowners for running businesses from their houses, James said. Yet you've been operating a daycare out of your garage without a license. That's a direct violation of state law and HOA rules. Karen's hands shook as she clutched her tablet. This is a smear campaign. James clicked again. Security footage of Karen's SUVs blocking a fire lane. Mark, the firefighter, stood up. Because of this, paramedics had to carry a stretcher down the block. That patient could have died. The room erupted. Residents shouted, demanded explanations. Mrs. Thompson, a longtime board member, stood up. Karen, is this true? Karen tried to speak, but the crowd's boiling frustration drowned her out. Then James delivered the final blow. Not only have you been fining people unfairly, he said, but the money from those fines, over $115,000, has been going to your brother's security company. Stunned silence. And then an explosion of outrage. You fined me for my rose bushes while you were scamming us. An elderly woman yelled. You had my car booted for being too old. But your company isn't even legal? Another neighbor shouted. I was paying for my child's hospital bills, and you fined me for a garden gnome? Sarah, the ER nurse, had tears in her eyes. Karen stepped back, her face red with anger. You can't do this. I was protecting the neighborhood. Mrs. Thompson raised her hand. I moved to immediately remove Karen Mitchell from the board. Seconded. 5 voices rang out at once. A vote was held. It was unanimous. Karen was officially removed from the HOA. But James wasn't done yet. One more thing, he said, stepping forward. Blocking emergency vehicles, fraud, and unauthorized surveillance? That's criminal misconduct. He turned to the 2 uniformed police officers standing near the door. Arrest her. Karen's mouth fell open. Wait, you can't. but she could only watch as the officer stepped forward, reading her rights. Justice had finally caught up with her. The neighborhood erupted in celebration. As soon as Karen was gone, the board voted to refund every unfair fine. Over $115,000 was returned to the residents. People hugged. Laughter filled the air. The dark cloud over their community had finally lifted. Sarah, the ER nurse, smiled for the first time in weeks. I can finally sleep without worrying about another stupid citation. Mark, the firefighter, high-fived James. Never thought I'd see the day. Even the elderly neighbors, who had lived in the community the longest, were beaming. This is what our neighborhood was meant to be, Mrs. Chin said. Not a dictatorship. A week later, James drove past Karen's house. A moving truck sat in the driveway. She was gone. Her brother's fake security vehicles? Also gone. The new HOA board wasted no time. They hired legitimate security patrols and rewrote the rules to prevent any future HOA abuse. James later heard that Karen had tried to join another HOA board 2 towns over, but her reputation had already reached them. They rejected her immediately. One evening, James was outside, watering his lawn, exactly 3.5 inches tall, just to make a point. A little girl ran up to him. It was Sarah's daughter. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, handing him a piece of paper. It was a handmade card, a crayon drawing of him in his police uniform, standing in front of a rainbow-colored house. The message read, "Thank you for making our neighborhood happy again." James smiled, his chest swelling with pride. That card now sat on his desk at the police station, a reminder that sometimes the most important battles aren't fought in the streets. Sometimes they happen right at home. And sometimes the real bad guys don't wear masks. They wear HOA badges. James Mitchell's story wasn't just about taking down one corrupt HOA board member. It was about standing up for what's right. It was about community. It was about reminding people that power is not meant to be abused. And in the end, the people won. Justice had prevailed. And their neighborhood? It was finally free.